how I knew my husband was cheating, and the proof I found. The moment I found my husband's second phone hidden inside our microwave, I knew my 8-year marriage was over. But what I discovered next would change everything I thought I knew about the man I'd shared a bed with for nearly a decade. Let me start from the beginning, because this story gets wild, and I mean really wild. My name's Sarah, I'm 34, and up until 3 months ago, I thought I had the perfect marriage. My husband Jake and I met in college, got married right after graduation, and built what I believed was a solid life together in suburban Phoenix. He's a successful software engineer. I work in marketing. We have a beautiful house, 2 cars, and we're even talking about starting a family. But you know how they say hindsight is 20/20? Well, looking back now, the signs were there for months. I just chose to ignore them because, honestly, who wants to believe their husband is cheating? It started with small things. Jake began working late more often, claiming his company was going through a major restructuring. He'd come home exhausted, barely able to hold a conversation, and would immediately disappear into his home office to finish up some work. At first, I bought it completely. The tech industry is demanding, right? Then came the gym membership. Now, Jake had never been what you'd call a fitness enthusiast. The man once ordered pizza because he was too tired to make a sandwich. So when he announced he'd joined CrossFit and would be going every morning at 5 a.m., I was surprised. But hey, I thought, good for him for wanting to get in shape. But here's where it gets interesting. And this is the part that should have been a massive red flag. Jake started showering at the gym every single day. He'd leave the house at 4:45 a.m. and come back around 7:30, already showered, hair still damp, smelling like generic gym soap instead of his usual body wash. When I asked about it, he said the gym had really nice facilities and it saved time. I'm not proud of what I did next, but desperation makes you do crazy things. One morning, I called his gym to ask about their hours. They opened at 6 a.m. Jake was supposedly there at 5. Strike one. The phone situation started getting weird around the same time. Jake had always been pretty casual with his phone. He'd leave it lying around, ask me to check messages while he was driving, the usual married couple stuff. But suddenly, that phone was glued to his hand. He started taking it to the bathroom, keeping it face down during dinner, and sleeping with it under his pillow instead of on the nightstand. When I jokingly asked if he was having an affair with his iPhone, he got defensive in a way that made my stomach drop. He snapped at me, saying I was being paranoid and controlling, then stormed out of the room. That was so unlike Jake that I knew something was seriously wrong. The real kicker? He started doing laundry. Let me explain why this is significant. In 8 years of marriage, Jake had touched the washing machine maybe 5 times, and that was only when I specifically asked him to throw in a load. This man once wore the same jeans for a week because he forgot laundry day existed. But suddenly, he's Mr. Clean, doing his own laundry every few days, always when I wasn't home. He'd volunteer to go grocery shopping just so he could throw in a load while I was gone. When I offered to help or asked why he was being so helpful, he'd brush it off, saying he wanted to be more responsible. Around the house, I started paying closer attention to what clothes he was washing. Designer shirts I'd never seen before. Cologne-scented undershirts. Once, I found a receipt in his jeans pocket for Victoria's Secret. When I confronted him about it, he claimed he was buying me a surprise gift for our anniversary, which was still 4 months away. The credit card statements were next. Jake handled most of our finances, but I had access to all our accounts. I started noticing charges I couldn't explain. Restaurants I'd never been to, gas stations across town from his office, a hotel charge for a Tuesday afternoon that he claimed was for a work meeting. When I asked about these expenses, he always had an explanation ready, almost too ready, like he'd been practicing. But the one that really got me was a charge for $200 at a spa. A couple's spa. When I asked about it, Jake said his company had bought gift certificates for employees as a stress relief initiative. He was saving it for us to use together. That gift certificate never materialized. Here's where I probably should have confronted him, but instead, I did something that changed everything. I hired a private investigator. I know. It sounds extreme, but I needed proof. I couldn't keep living in this state of constant suspicion, and I certainly wasn't going to blow up my marriage based on hunches and Victoria's Secret receipts. The PI's name was Marcus, and he looked exactly like you'd expect a private investigator to look. Weathered face, tired eyes, and the kind of mustache that belonged in a 1980s cop show. He quoted me, $500 for a basic surveillance package, which felt like both too much and too little money to potentially destroy my life. 3 days later, Marcus called me at work. His voice was gentle, almost apologetic when he told me he had photos. Jake wasn't at CrossFit. He wasn't at work meetings. He was at a coffee shop across town, and he wasn't alone. But this is where the story takes a turn that I never saw coming. The woman in the photos wasn't what I expected. She wasn't some young, glamorous homewrecker. She was probably in her early 50s, with graying hair and laugh lines, wearing a simple cardigan and jeans. She looked like someone's aunt, not a mistress. Marcus had captured them holding hands across a small table, Jake leaning in close to whisper, something that made her laugh. In one photo, she was wiping tears from her eyes while Jake held both her hands. They looked intimate, but not in the way I'd imagined. I studied those photos for hours, trying to understand what I was seeing. This woman looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. There was something about her face, her posture, that nagged at me. Then I found the second phone. This happened completely by accident. I was reheating leftover Chinese takeout and noticed the microwave was making a weird buzzing sound. When I opened it to check if something was wrong there, it was a small smartphone I'd never seen before, hidden behind a rotating plate. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. The phone was old, maybe 3 years old, with a cracked screen protector and a cheap case. It wasn't password protected. What I found in that phone changed everything. The text messages went back 6 months, but they weren't what I expected. They weren't sexting or romantic messages or plans for secret rendezvous. They were family conversations, messages about doctor's appointments, medication schedules, and grocery lists, photos of flowers and sunsets with captions like "thinking of you today" and "hope this brightens your morning." There were voice messages, hours of them. And when I played the first one, I heard Jake's voice, but softer than I'd ever heard it. He was reading a book out loud, pausing occasionally to make comments about the characters or plot. The woman's voice would respond, sometimes laughing, sometimes asking questions. They were having book club conversations. I listened to 12 hours of these recordings before I understood what was happening. The woman's name was Linda, and she was Jake's mother. Let me explain, because I know this sounds insane. Jake's mother had died when he was 16. I'd met his father a few times before we got married, but Jake rarely talked about his family. He told me his relationship with his father was complicated, and I'd always assumed his reluctance to discuss his childhood was just typical guy behavior. What I didn't know was that Jake's father had remarried 6 months after his first wife died. The new wife, Linda, had tried to build a relationship with Jake, but he was angry, grieving, and convinced she was trying to replace his mother. He'd left for college and basically cut contact with both of them. But here's the part that made me question everything I thought I knew about my husband. 3 years ago, Jake's father had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. Linda had reached out to Jake through social media, not to ask for money or help, but to let him know his father was asking for him. The disease was progressing quickly, and there were days when Jake's dad would forget that his first wife had died. Asking Linda where Sarah was, Jake's mother had the same name as me. Jake had been secretly rebuilding a relationship with Linda, and through her, trying to reconnect with his father before it was too late. The coffee shop meetings were Linda giving Jake updates on his father's condition. The hotel charge was for a room near the memory care facility where his dad lived, 2 hours away. Jake had been visiting every other week for months, spending entire days sitting with his father, reading to him, trying to trigger memories. The Victoria's Secret receipt? That was for Linda. Jake's father kept asking for his first wife, becoming agitated when she didn't appear. Linda had been telling him she was out shopping, that she'd be back soon, anything to keep him calm. But the father kept asking why she didn't dress the way she used to, why she looked different. Jake had been buying Linda clothes similar to what his mother used to wear, helping her play this elaborate, heartbreaking role to keep his father comfortable in his final stages of memory loss. The gym story was a lie, but not for the reason I thought. Jake wasn't having an affair. He was having a breakdown. All those early morning workouts were actually Jake sitting in his car in various parking lots, crying. Sometimes he'd call Linda. Sometimes he'd just sit there, trying to work up the courage to visit his father, or dealing with the emotional aftermath of a visit. The laundry obsession was because he was washing clothes that smelled like the memory care facility. That distinctive combination of disinfectant and sadness that clings to everything. He didn't want me to smell it and ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. Marcus, the PI, had more photos Photos of Jake in the parking lot of Sunset Manor Memory Care, sitting in his car with his head in his hands. Photos of him walking into the building, carrying flowers and books. Photos of him leaving 3 hours later, looking emotionally drained. There was even a photo of Jake, Linda, and an elderly man I didn't recognize sitting together in what looked like a garden. The elderly man was holding Jake's hand, and Jake was smiling, but his eyes were red. That was Jake's father. The man looked nothing like the photos Jake had shown me from his childhood. Alzheimer's had aged him decades in just a few years. I confronted Jake that night, and it was the most heartbreaking conversation of our marriage. He broke down completely when I showed him the second phone. He told me everything, how guilty he felt for abandoning his family, how scared he was of losing his father before they could reconcile, how ashamed he was that he needed Linda's help to navigate his father's illness. He'd been lying to me for months, not because he was cheating, but because he didn't know how to explain that he was grieving a relationship he'd never had, trying to make peace with his stepmother he'd resented for 18 years, and watching his father disappear piece by piece. Jake had convinced himself that I wouldn't understand, that I'd think less of him for being such a mess. About a family he'd supposedly cut ties with years ago. He thought he could handle it alone, get closure with his father, and then tell me everything once it was over. But here's the thing that really got to me, and this is where I realized I might not be the wife I thought I was. I was angry, not about the affair that wasn't happening, but about the lies, about being excluded from such a huge part of his life, about him thinking I couldn't handle his complicated family situation when I'd been handling our complicated marriage just fine. We had a massive fight. I accused him of treating me like a stranger, of not trusting me with the hard parts of his life. He accused me of being so focused on our perfect marriage that he felt like he couldn't show me his messy, broken pieces. We were both right, and we were both wrong. The next morning, I did something that surprised both of us. I called Linda. Using the number from Jake's secret phone, I called his stepmother and asked if I could meet her. I needed to understand what had been happening, and I needed to hear it from someone who wasn't my emotionally devastated husband. Linda agreed to meet me at the same coffee shop where Marcus had photographed her with Jake. When I walked in, I recognized her immediately, not from the photos, but from Jake's face. He had her eyes. She was nervous, clearly expecting me to be angry or confrontational. Instead, I sat down and asked her to tell me about Jake's father. What she told me changed how I saw everything. Jake's mother had been Linda's best friend in high school. When Jake's mom was diagnosed with cancer, she'd asked Linda to promise to look after her family if something happened to her. Linda had agreed, thinking it was just scared talk from a sick friend. When Jake's mother died, Linda had tried to honor that promise. She married Jake's father not out of some quick rebound romance, but because two broken people were trying to hold together the pieces of a shattered family. Jake's father was barely functional in his grief, and 16-year-old Jake was angry at the world. Linda had spent 18 years respecting Jake's need for distance while quietly making sure his father didn't completely fall apart. When the Alzheimer's diagnosis came, she'd reached out to Jake not because she needed help, but because she thought he deserved the chance to say goodbye. She showed me videos on her phone that Jake had never seen. His father in his lucid moments, talking about his son, expressing regret for not fighting harder to maintain their relationship, worrying that Jake thought his father had forgotten about him or stopped loving him when Linda came into the picture. In one video, his father was looking through old photo albums, pointing to pictures of teenage Jake and telling Linda stories I'd never heard. About Jake's first job, his college graduation, our wedding, events his father had missed, but had somehow kept track of through mutual friends and social media. The man had been carrying 18 years of regret about his relationship with his son, and the Alzheimer's was taking away his chance to fix it. I asked Linda why Jake was buying her clothes. She looked embarrassed when she explained. Jake's father had good days and bad days, but on the bad days, he'd become agitated if Linda didn't look right. He'd ask why Sarah, Jake's mother, had changed her hair, why she was wearing different clothes, why she looked older. The medical staff had suggested going along with his confusion rather than constantly correcting him, which just made him more upset. So Linda had been slowly changing her appearance to match his fading memories of his first wife. It was breaking her heart, but it kept him calm. Jake had figured this out during one of his visits and had been trying to help by buying clothes similar to what his mother used to wear. The Victoria's Secret purchase was for a perfume his mother had loved. Linda had been wearing it during visits to help trigger positive memories. I realized I needed to meet Jake's father. That weekend, Jake and I drove to Sunset Manor together. I was terrified, not of meeting his father, but of seeing Jake fall apart again. The emotional toll of these visits was obvious, and I finally understood why. He'd been so exhausted and distant. Jake's father was having a good day when we arrived. He knew who Jake was, recognized Linda, and was politely confused about who I was until Jake explained that I was his wife. The man lit up. He grabbed my hands and told me I was beautiful, that Jake had good taste just like his father. He asked if we had children yet, if Jake was treating me well, if I knew what a good boy his son was. It was heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time. But then Jake's father asked to speak to me alone. Jake and Linda stepped out of the room, leaving me with this man I just met who was fighting a disease that was stealing his memories day by day. He looked directly at me and, in a moment of perfect clarity, told me he was proud of Jake for finding someone who would come visit an old man she'd never met. He said he could tell I loved his son because I was there, and that meant everything to him. Then he asked me to take care of Jake when he was gone, because Jake had always been too hard on himself, always carried too much guilt about things that weren't his fault. He knew he was dying. He knew his memory was going, and he was worried about his son. That conversation changed everything for me. I realized that Jake hadn't been excluding me from his family drama. He'd been protecting me from it. He'd been trying to handle this impossible situation without dragging me into the emotional chaos, not because he didn't trust me, but because he loved me too much to make his pain my pain. But that's not how marriage works. You don't get to protect your spouse from the hard parts of life. You face them together, even when it's messy and complicated and there are no good solutions. We started going to the memory care facility together. Every other weekend, Jake and I would drive 2 hours to spend the day with his father and Linda. Some days were good. His father would be alert and conversational, sharing stories about Jake's childhood that I'd never heard. Other days were hard. He'd be confused, agitated, sometimes not recognizing anyone, but we did it together. I got to know Linda, who turned out to be one of the most selfless people I'd ever met. She'd spent nearly 2 decades loving a man who couldn't fully love her back because he was still grieving his first wife, and now she was caring for him as he slowly forgot who she was. I also got to know a side of Jake I'd never seen. The son who was trying to make up for 18 years of lost time, who would sit for hours reading to his father or just holding his hand when words became too difficult. Jake's father died on a Tuesday morning in March. Jake got the call from Linda while he was at work. By the time he got to the facility, his father was gone. The funeral was small, just Jake, Linda, me, and a few of Linda's friends. Jake gave a eulogy that made everyone cry, talking about regret and forgiveness and the complicated ways we love our families. But the most beautiful moment came after the service, when Linda pulled Jake aside and told him his father's last coherent words had been about him. He'd asked Linda to make sure Jake knew he was proud of him, that he understood why Jake had needed distance, and that he'd never stopped loving his son. Here's the part that will probably make you cry. A week after the funeral, Linda called Jake to ask if he wanted his father's belongings. When we went to pick them up, she handed Jake a shoebox full of items his father had saved over the years. Every Christmas card we'd sent, every newspaper clipping mentioning Jake's work, photos of our wedding that he'd somehow gotten from mutual friends, a letter Jake had written to his father from college, angry, hurt letter that Jake didn't even remember sending, that his father had kept for 15 years. At the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope with Jake's name on it, written in his father's handwriting. Inside was a letter his father had written 3 years earlier, right after his Alzheimer's diagnosis, while he could still think clearly. In the letter, Jake's father apologized for everything, for remarrying too quickly, for not fighting harder, to maintain their relationship, for letting pride and grief damage their family. He wrote about how proud he was of the man Jake had become, how grateful he was that Jake had found love with me, and how much he regretted missing so many years of his son's life. The letter ended with his father asking Jake to forgive him and to take care of Linda, who had sacrificed her own happiness to hold their broken family together. That letter broke Jake completely, but it also healed something in him. We spent the next few weeks talking through everything, the lies, the secrets, the pain we'd both been Carrying. Jake apologized for shutting me out, and I apologized for not creating a safe space where he felt he could share his complicated feelings about his family. We went to couples therapy, which sounds dramatic, but honestly, it helped us figure out how to be married to each other instead of to the idealized versions of ourselves we've been trying to maintain. Linda became family. This woman who had been a stranger 6 months earlier became one of the most important people in our lives. She'd lost the only family she'd known for 20 years, and we'd gained the mother-in-law Jake had never let himself have. Linda moved closer to us after the funeral. She bought a small house 15 minutes away and became the person we called when we needed advice, wanted company for dinner, or just needed someone to talk to who understood complicated family dynamics. She also became the person who helped me understand Jake in ways I never had before. She told me stories about his childhood, explained some of his quirks and habits, and helped me see that the man I'd married was carrying decades of unresolved family trauma that had nothing to do with me. But here's the twist that no one saw coming, including us. Linda had never had children of her own. She'd spent her entire adult life caring for other people's families, first as Jake's stepmother and then as his father's caregiver. At 62, she was finally free to live her own life for the first time, and she was terrified. Jake and I helped her navigate this new chapter, setting up online dating profiles, which was hilarious, exploring hobbies she'd never had time for, even planning a trip to Europe she'd been dreaming about. For 40 years, watching Linda discover herself was like watching someone wake up from a very long sleep. She started taking art classes, joined a hiking group, and even went on a few dates with a widower she met at the grocery store. The most beautiful part of this whole story happened 6 months after Jake's father died. Jake and I were having dinner with Linda when she made an announcement. She'd been thinking about what Jake's father had written in his letter about taking care of each other and not letting pride or fear damage relationships. She looked at Jake and told him she loved him like a son, that she was proud of the man he'd become, and that she hoped we could continue being family even though the person who connected them was gone. Then she looked at me and thanked me for giving her the chance to finally have a relationship with Jake that she'd wanted for 20 years but never thought was possible. Jake cried. I cried. Linda cried. The waitress probably thought we were having some kind of breakdown, but we didn't care. We're different people now than we were a year ago. Jake learned that marriage means sharing your broken pieces, not just your shiny parts. I learned that love sometimes means sitting with someone in their pain instead of trying to fix it. Our marriage is stronger, but it's also messy, eh? We fight more, but we also laugh more. We've stopped trying to be the perfect couple and started trying to be real people who choose each other every day, even when it's hard. Linda is teaching me to knit, which I'm terrible at but love anyway. Jake is teaching her to use her smartphone, which she's terrible at but loves anyway. We spend most Sundays together, sometimes talking about serious things, sometimes just watching cooking shows and making fun of the contestants. The private investigator, Marcus, sent me a bill for his services with a note attached. He wrote that in 30 years of investigating cheating spouses, he'd never been happier to be wrong about a case. He said most of his stories end with divorce papers and custody battles, but ours ended with a family coming back together. He also said he was going to use our story, with names changed, as an example of why communication in marriage is so important. Sometimes the worst thing you can imagine isn't what's actually happening. Sometimes it's something completely different that needs compassion instead of confrontation. I still have Jake's secret phone. We've talked about getting rid of it, but somehow it seems important to keep. It's a reminder that people are more complicated than we think, that love comes in different forms, and that sometimes the scariest conversations lead to the most beautiful outcomes. Sometimes I scroll through those old text messages between Jake and Linda, reading their careful, tentative attempts to rebuild a relationship that had been broken for so long. Their messages are full of apologies and gratitude and small kindnesses, asking about doctor's appointments, sharing photos of sunsets, checking in during bad days. It's a masterclass in how people can choose to love each other even when it's difficult, even when there's history and hurt and no guarantee that trying will work out. So here's what I learned from thinking my husband was cheating. Marriage isn't about knowing everything about your partner. It's about creating a safe space where they can tell you anything, even the things that scare them or make them feel ashamed. Family is more complicated than we want it to be, And sometimes the people who love us most are the ones we push away because we're afraid of being hurt again. Forgiveness isn't a one-time event. It's a choice you make over and over, especially when someone you love has disappointed you or themselves. And sometimes the worst thing you can imagine turns out to be a door to something beautiful you never knew you needed. Jake and I are trying for a baby now. We've been talking about what kind of parents we want to be, what kind of family we want to create. We know it won't be perfect. We're both products of complicated families, and we're going to mess up sometimes. But we also know that love isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, telling the truth, and choosing each other even when it's hard. Linda is going to be the best grandmother in the world. She's already started a savings account for our future children's college funds and has been sending me articles about pregnancy and child development. She's the kind of woman who will babysit on date nights and remember every birthday and school play. Jake's father never got to meet his grandchildren, but in a way, his love is going to be part of their story, too, because his death brought Jake and Linda together, and Linda is going to make sure her kids know about their grandfather, the man who made mistakes but never stopped loving his son. The microwave still buzzes sometimes. We had it repaired, but occasionally it makes that same weird sound that led me to find Jake's secret phone. Every time it happens, Jake and I look at each other and smile. It's our reminder that sometimes the things that seem broken are actually working exactly the way they're supposed to. Sometimes the noise that annoys you is actually trying to tell you something important. And sometimes the worst discovery of your life turns out to be the best thing that ever happened to your marriage. Update. Linda got engaged last month. Remember that widower she met at the grocery store? His name is Robert. He's 65, and he makes Linda laugh in a way I've never seen before. He lost his wife to cancer 3 years ago and has 2 adult children who live across the country. Jake walked Linda down the aisle at their small wedding ceremony. I was her maid of honor. It was the first wedding I'd ever been to where everyone cried during the vows because we were all just so happy that these two people had found each other. Robert is kind and patient and genuinely seems to think Linda hung the moon. He listens to her stories about Jake's father without jealousy, includes Jake and me in their plans without resentment, and has made it clear that he's marrying Linda and her chosen family. At the reception, Robert made a toast where he thanked Jake's father for taking such good care of Linda and promised to love her the way she deserved to be loved. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. So that's my story. It started with me thinking my husband was having an affair and ended with me gaining a mother-in-law, watching a beautiful woman find love for the first time in her life, and learning that marriage is about so much more than I ever understood. The proof I found wasn't evidence of betrayal. It was evidence of love. Complicated, messy, imperfect. Love that didn't look like what I expected, but was exactly what we all needed. Jake still goes to therapy sometimes, working through his complicated feelings about family and loss and forgiveness. I go with him occasionally, and we're both learning that healing isn't a destination. It's a process. We're not the same people we were when this story started, and our marriage isn't the same either. It's better, but it's also more work. We've learned that love isn't about avoiding problems. It's about facing them together. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, facing your problems leads you to discover that your family is bigger and more beautiful than you ever imagined it could be. The end. But not really, because the best stories don't have endings. They have new beginnings. And Jake, Linda, Robert, and I are still writing ours, one Sunday dinner at a time.